Christmas Eve should smell like cinnamon pine and second chances. Instead, mine began with the sharp click of a chain sliding into place. I hadn't even brushed the snow from my coat when Caleb cracked the door open, just an inch enough for me to glimpse the warm glow of dinner behind him, the kind of warmth a man expects from his own family. Then Marissa stepped forward, her hand locking around his arm like she feared he might let me inside. Her voice cut cleaner than the winter wind. "This isn't your night." No pause. No apology. Just a sentence that felt like the end of something I didn't realize was already dying. Behind her, I heard silverware clink, chairs scrape, a burst of laughter, sounds of a celebration I wasn't welcome in. And then I saw it, a small shadow stretching across the living room wall, before someone pulled the curtain shut. Hazel's shadow. There one moment, gone the next. That was when a heavy thought settled in my chest, and if they could close the door this easily, what had they already taken from me without a word? I stepped back into the falling snow, unaware that the cold waiting for me had nothing to do with winter. And just like that, the evening that would change everything began. The snow had been falling since the afternoon, a slow and steady curtain drifting over the quiet streets of Ohio. I drove through it in silence, the heater humming low, my father's pocket watch resting beside me on the passenger seat. The silver casing caught the passing streetlights, and for a moment it felt like he was there with me, reminding me of the nights he handed things down without speeches, only with a look that said, "A man should know when a moment matters." I parked in front of Caleb's house and killed the engine. For a while I just sat there watching the windows glow with that golden light families seem to have only on nights like this. I remembered a Christmas years ago when Caleb was 10 and insisted on staying up to catch Santa in the act. Evelyn made hot chocolate for us, and we sat by the tree until he fell asleep on my shoulder. I used to think memories like that were unbreakable. When I finally stepped onto the porch, the cold wrapped around me like something alive. I pressed the doorbell and heard the chime echo through the house. The music inside stopped for a moment before footsteps approached the door. It cracked open just wide enough for Caleb's face to appear. He smiled, but it was the thin kind of smile people use when they hope a conversation ends quickly. Before I could say a word, Marissa appeared behind him. She rested her hand on his arm and said, "It wasn't a good time that tonight was for her family, and things were already crowded." Her tone was even almost polite, but her eyes were already moving past me, as if I were a delivery driver who knocked on the wrong door. I nodded. I did not argue. A man learns to recognize when a decision has already been made. Caleb avoided my eyes and said he would call me tomorrow. The door closed gently, the way people close things they do not intend to open again. I stood there for a moment. Snow clung to my coat and hair. The sounds inside grew louder. Laughter rising and falling like a warm tide. None of it reached me. The pocket watch slipped in my hand and popped open. The paper inside had wrinkled over time, but my father's handwriting was still there. "Give this only to the one who honors it." I read the line twice, maybe 3 times, until the words blurred a little. A movement caught my eye. Someone inside pulled the curtain tight, blocking the last sliver of light from the window. They had known I would come. They had chosen this. I walked back to my truck slowly, every step sinking into the snow. I glanced once more at the house. I thought of Hazel laughing in the living room last year, her small hands tugging at my sleeve. I wondered if she asked where I was tonight, or if she had already been taught not to. I sat behind the steering wheel and let the quiet settle over me. The watch ticked softly in my pocket, steady and patient, as if waiting for me to understand something I had spent too long ignoring. I pulled away from the curb, and the house disappeared behind falling snow. At the end of the street, I stopped at a red light, and rested my hands on the wheel. The cold outside was nothing compared to the cold that had settled in my chest. I realized then that this night had not taken anything from me. It had only shown me what had already been lost. I drove on through the empty roads, letting the engine carry me into the kind of silence a man reaches only once he understands he has been left out not just of a dinner, not just of a holiday, but of his own family. The road home stretched ahead of me like a long ribbon of white. I kept driving even after the neighborhood lights faded behind me, letting the quiet settle inside the truck. The wipers brushed the snow in slow arcs, and the heater hummed low, but none of it warmed the place in my chest that had begun to ache since the moment that door closed on me. When I turned onto my street, I slowed the truck without thinking. A dark SUV sat in my driveway, idling in the snow. Its exhaust curled upward in thin white streams. The lights were on in my kitchen, glowing the way they used to when Evelyn waited up for me after a late shift. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw that light, because for months now that house greeted me with nothing but silence. My phone lit up with an unread message. Caleb had written earlier that he stopped by to pick up some old boxes and would lock up. He ended it with the same 2 words he used since high school, the same 2 words that came easy when life did not demand much from him. I stared at them until the cold started to slip past my collar. I left the truck a short distance away and walked through the snow, the sound of my boots swallowed by the wind. The air stung my face and I pulled my coat tighter as I moved along the side of the house. The kitchen window glowed ahead of me and I slowed my steps, keeping close to the wall. I could hear something inside. It was faint at first, then clear enough once I stopped breathing long enough to listen. Marissa was pacing across my kitchen floor. Her heels tapped against the tile in firm, quick beats. She spoke with the kind of confidence that fills a room and leaves no space for doubt. She told Caleb that they were close, that all it took was one more step, that once the paperwork was signed, everything would fall into place. The words were spoken calmly, almost too calmly, like she had rehearsed them more than once. Caleb answered her in a hushed voice. There was a tremor in the way he said he was scared. Another tremor when he said the debt was nearly $180,000. It hit me harder than her words did. Hearing him like that, afraid and cornered, stirred something old inside me. A father's instinct to reach for his son. A man's instinct to look away from a truth he does not want to see. Marissa cut him off. The tone of someone steering a ship whose captain had already given up the wheel. She said he needed to stop hesitating, that he needed to get me to sign. Her voice carried no pity, no second thoughts, just certainty. Inside the kitchen, something clattered against the counter. Maybe a glass, maybe a plate. The heater kicked on with a low drone, the kind I always heard when I came home late from work. The details of that sound made the moment feel worse. They were living inside the life I built, walking through it like they owned every corner. Caleb let out a quiet breath. I heard it even through the window. He said he did not want things to fall apart, that he did not want Hazel to get dragged into it. For a moment, just a brief one, I could tell he still knew right from wrong. It flickered through his voice like the last bit of light before a candle goes out. Then Marissa spoke again, and the flicker was gone. I stepped back from the window, the snow crunching under my heel. My hand brushed the siding of the house, cold and stiff. I could feel the sting behind my ribs, not sharp but deep, the way an old injury makes itself known on cold days. It was the weight of understanding, the kind no man asks for. The SUV idled quietly in the driveway, its headlights dimmed by the falling snow. I walked toward my truck with slow steps, my breath hanging in the air. When I reached for the door handle, I paused and let my gaze settle on the house. The window glowed steadily, warm and bright, touching the kitchen floor, the same way it had every night when Evelyn cooked dinner. I never imagined it would shine on something like this. I slid into the truck and closed the door without starting the engine. The pocket watch lay in my coat, again heavy and familiar. I took it out, but did not open it. I held it the way a man holds a truth he is not ready to face but cannot put down. The SUV's brake lights glowed red for a moment, then faded as someone inside shifted in their seat. The color flashed across my windshield like a warning. I watched it until it disappeared into the falling snow. The heater slowly warmed the air around me. I leaned back and let the quiet settle once more. The road ahead was dark and empty. I knew I would drive it soon. I also knew that tonight had drawn a line no one could step back from. The snow thickened, drifting across the hood of the truck. I exhaled once, a long, steady breath, the kind a man takes when he knows something inside him has shifted and will not shift back. Then I put the truck in gear and rolled forward, watching the light from my kitchen fade in the rearview mirror until it became just another blur in the snow. The next morning carried the kind of quiet that follows a sleepless night. Snow still lay across the yard untouched except for the tracks I left when I came home. I stood at the mailbox with my breath rising in faint curls, feeling the cold settle deeper into my hands as I sorted through envelopes. Most were the usual bills and winter newsletters, the kind of mail a man flips through without reading. One envelope felt different. Thicker paper. A printed return address from a title company I had used years ago. My name typed cleanly on the front. I tore it open on the walk back to the house. The letter inside was written in the careful tone companies use when they expect trouble. It said that a notary had declined to certify a deed transfer bearing my signature. It said the signature did not match previous records. It said the matter had been forwarded to the county sheriff for verification. I read it twice, maybe 3 times, though the words sank in faster than I wanted. Inside the house, the heat clicked on with its usual groan. I set the letter on the kitchen table and stared at it, while the snow outside cast its pale light across the floor. My name, printed again and again, felt hollow. For a moment I tried to imagine a harmless explanation, something simple and reasonable, the kind of thing a father tells himself when he wants to believe his family still works the way he hoped it did. But I could still hear Marissa's voice in my mind and Caleb's nervous whisper, and the truth rose before me whether I wanted it or not. I picked up the phone and called Richard Farnsworth. He answered on the 3rd ring. His voice carried the same steady warmth it always had, even after 4 years since we lost Evelyn. I told him I needed to see him and that it could not wait. He did not ask questions. He told me to come by his office within the hour. The drive to his building was slow. The streets were plowed unevenly, and the wind pushed light drifts across the pavement. I parked by the side entrance and walked through the slush toward the glass doors. His office sat on the 2nd floor, a small space overlooking the river that ran behind the old mill. The halls were dim, the carpet soft under my boots. When I stepped into his office, he was already standing, adjusting stacks of papers on his desk. He looked at me for a moment, as if trying to read what kind of weight I carried with me. I handed him the letter. He read it without speaking, then set it down and motioned for me to sit. His chair creaked as he lowered himself into it, the way it always had when he and Evelyn would discuss paperwork late into the night. He asked me to tell him everything. I took a moment before answering. The words felt heavy in my mouth but came out anyway. The door closing on Christmas Eve. The SUV. The voices behind my kitchen window. As I spoke, Richard leaned back and folded his hands, not interrupting, not judging. When I finished, he let out a slow breath. He reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written on it. The handwriting stopped my heart for a moment. It was Evelyn's. Her loops and strokes steady even when her body had grown weak. Richard rested the envelope in my hand and sat in silence, giving me the space to open it. I slid my thumb under the flap and unfolded the paper. Her scent was gone, but the memory of it rushed through me anyway. The letter was brief. She wrote that if a day came when Caleb allowed Marissa to lead him, he might be pushed into choices he would never make on his own. She wrote that I needed to protect Hazel if that day ever arrived. She wrote that love sometimes means standing guard, even when your heart wants to look away. My vision blurred before I reached the end. I felt the weight of the chair beneath me, the softness of the carpet under my boots, the quiet of the room pressing against my ears. It was the first time since her funeral that tears came without resistance. They slid down my face and fell onto the paper in small, uneven drops. I wiped them away with the back of my hand, but the ache stayed where it was. Richard stood and placed a hand on my shoulder. He said nothing, which was the most kindness anyone could have offered in that moment. I held the letter for a while, letting the reality of her words work through me. She had seen something forming long before I noticed a single sign. She had understood our son's weaknesses, and she had trusted me to face them if they ever grew into something dangerous. The room felt smaller as I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. Outside the window, the river lay still beneath a thin sheet of ice. Snow drifted from the overcast sky and settled on its surface without sound. The world continued at its own pace while mine shifted beneath me. I thanked Richard and stood up. My legs felt heavier than they had in years. He walked me to the door and asked gently if I would be all right. I told him I would manage. A man says that even when he is not sure. I stepped into the hallway and listened to the door ease shut behind me. The faint echo followed me toward the stairs. Outside, the air was sharper than before. My breath curled upward as I walked back to the truck. The letter and Evelyn's envelope lay inside my coat, their weight forming a single truth I could no longer ignore. I sat for a while with my hands resting on the wheel. Snow tapped lightly against the windshield. The engine hummed beneath me when I started it. As I pulled out of the lot, the river came into view again between the trees. The branches swayed under the weight of winter. I followed the curve of the road, letting the engine carry me forward through the quiet. The day had changed, though nothing around me looked different. Something had settled into place, not loud or sudden, but certain. Before reaching the bridge, I slowed the truck and pulled over for a moment. I watched the river through the windshield, the ice shifting slightly where the current moved beneath it. The sky held that pale winter light that makes everything look softer and colder at the same time. I rested my hand on the pocket where the letters lay. The truth was there now, written by the people who knew me best. The title company, the notary, Evelyn. 3 pieces of a story that pointed in the same direction. A gust of wind swept across the river and rattled the bare branches above me. I listened to the sound for a moment before putting the truck back in gear. The tires crunched over the snow as I pulled onto the road again. The letters stayed close to my chest, their edges firm against the fabric of my coat. The day ahead was quiet, but the truth within it had already begun to unfold. By late afternoon, the light outside my living room window had turned that dull winter gray that makes the day feel shorter than it should. I sat in my chair with Evelyn's letter folded in my hand, the edges soft under my thumb. The paper had already begun to curl, as if it knew it had been waiting too long to be read. The phone on the small table beside me buzzed once and lit up. It was Richard. His voice sounded steady, but there was a weight under it that had not been there in the morning. He told me he had gone through some of my old files and that we should talk again. He asked if I could come back to the office before he closed for the day. I said I would be there. The sky had darkened by the time I pulled into the lot behind his building. The river beside it ran under patches of ice, and the wind moved through the bare trees with a low rush. Inside the hallway, lights cast a soft yellow glow over the carpet. I knocked lightly on his office door and stepped in when he answered. His desk was spread with folders. Some had my name written on them in his neat handwriting, the ink slightly faded. He gestured to the chair across from him and waited until I sat down. His face carried that careful expression I had seen when he talked to families about wills and estates, the kind of look men wear when they know what they are about to say will shift something in the room. He opened one of the folders and took out a set of papers. The pages were clipped together in a tight stack. He turned them so I could see my own name printed along the top of the first page. It was a durable power of attorney form. I remembered the layout even before I read the words. He reminded me about the night 9 months earlier when I had a scare with my chest. A tightness that sent me to the emergency room, the kind that makes a ped wonder if this might be the time that everything stops. It turned out to be nothing more than a warning from a body that had carried steel and grease and long hours for too many years. Still, it shook me. I remembered being back home sitting at this same kitchen table, the hospital band still on my wrist. Caleb and Marissa had come over with takeout and insisted I sit while they cleaned up the dishes. They moved around the kitchen like they owned the place. There was a moment when Caleb brought a folder to the table and sat down across from me. He told me they had talked to someone who said it would be smart to have paperwork in place. He said it would make it easier for them to take care of me if something happened. Marissa stood behind him and rested her hands on his shoulders, nodding along. I remembered feeling the tug between gratitude and caution. A man who spends his life handling his own bills and fixing his own problems does not hand his signature away so easily. I had told them I appreciated the thought, but that I would not sign anything that night. I wanted to talk to Richard first. I could see the flicker in Marissa's eyes when I said his name. She hid it quickly under a smile, but it was there. Caleb looked disappointed, but he let it drop. Or I thought he did. Now in Richard's office, the same form lay on the desk. He tapped his finger gently against the corner of the page. He told me that this copy was the one they had brought for me to sign that night. His file note said I had called the next day and asked him to look into it, then told him I would hold off. He set that stack aside and opened another folder. Inside was a photocopy of a different document, another deed transfer form. My name again. My signature again. Only this one, he said, had never passed through his hands. He explained that the notary who refused to sign at the title company was not the first person to question my signature. He had spoken with a local notary. He knew a woman who had handled paperwork for half the town for 20 years. She remembered Caleb coming in months before with a set of documents he said I had signed at home. She had looked at the signature, and something about it felt wrong. She told him she needed to verify it, and asked him to bring me in. He never did. She turned him away and made a note of it. I sat there listening, the edges of Evelyn's letter warm against my palm inside my coat. Each detail fit into the last one like pieces of a puzzle I had never wanted to see complete. Richard was not done. He mentioned Rosemary next. He had called her, he said, just to ask if she had noticed anything different about my behavior lately. She told him I still shoveled my walk before the sun came up and carried my own groceries like always. Then she asked why he wanted to know. He told her he could not share much, but wondered if anyone had said anything about me. That was when she told him about the afternoons, when Marissa would come out to the sidewalk with visitors. How she would speak just a bit louder than necessary, saying that I was starting to slip, that I forgot things, that it would not be long before I needed a nursing home. She had laughed when she said it. Rosemary told him as if it were a joke that made her sound concerned and generous at the same time. The kind of joke that plants an idea in a listener's mind while still giving them a reason to smile. I felt my jaw tighten as he spoke. Rosemary had waved at me only a few days earlier while taking out her trash. She told me to be careful on the ice and asked about the old snowblower I kept in the garage. Not once did she treat me as anything less than the man she had known for years. Yet somewhere in the spaces between our homes, another version of me had been introduced. One I did not recognize. Richard leaned forward and pulled all the pages together into a single stack: the DPOA form, the title company letter, the notary note, the memory of that night at my table. He lined them up in front of me and let them sit there on the wood, the edges neat, the story not neat at all. He spoke quietly. He said this was not a mistake, not a misunderstanding. In his work he had seen rushed decisions and messy paperwork, but he had also seen patterns. This, he said, was a pattern. First, a push for control at a moment when my health seemed uncertain. Then, when I refused an attempt to move ahead without me. Then another attempt pushed far enough to reach the attention of a title company and a sheriff. His words fell into the room and stayed there. I did not answer right away. I stared at my own name printed across each page and felt something inside me settle into a colder place. Not a sudden snap, more like the way a river freezes from the edges inward. In that moment, I thought back to the porch on Christmas Eve, to the door that closed in my face, to the hands pulling the curtains shut. I realized those moments had not broken anything. They had only revealed what had already cracked long before I noticed. Richard watched me with that steady gaze. He asked what I wanted to do. I could hear the hum of the heater, the faint sounds of traffic far below the window, the subtle rustle of paper as I shifted in my chair. My answer did not come easily, but it did come. I told him I needed to know just how far this had gone, and that whatever we did next would have to be careful and clean. He nodded and began to gather the papers. I rose from my chair and slipped Evelyn's envelope back into my pocket. The room felt different now. Not smaller, not larger, just clearer. When I stepped out of his office, the hallway was quiet, the overhead lights casting long reflections on the polished floor. I moved toward the stairs and paused at the top for a moment, listening to the faint echo of my own footsteps. Outside, the sky had shifted into evening. The river continued its slow movement under the ice. I walked to my truck and placed my hand on the cold metal of the door before getting in. The snow in the lot had been disturbed by only a few tire tracks, leaving most of it smooth and untouched. I sat for a moment without starting the engine and looked at the windshield, where thin flakes began to stick to the glass. Somewhere behind me on Richard's desk, my name was written on more documents than I cared to count. Somewhere ahead of me in a house that had once been mine in every way that mattered, another version of my future had been drawn up without me. The engine turned over and the truck shuddered to life. I pulled out slowly, the tires crunching over the thin layer of snow, and let the dark road take me back into the quiet that waited on the other side of town. The house was dark when I walked in, the kind of darkness that does not greet you, but settles around you like something patient and watchful. I hung my coat on the back of the chair and sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Caleb once did his homework, while Evelyn cooked supper. The clock on the stove blinked past midnight. The hands moved with a soft click that filled the quiet. I spread out my financial papers in front of me. The pages caught the thin light from the over-the-sink lamp and shone in pale shades of white and gray. My glasses rested beside them. I did not put them on at first. I just stared at the numbers until they blurred. Every shift I took during winter storms to make ends meet. Every holiday I missed so the boy could have presents under the tree. It all drifted through my mind like long shadows stretching across years I could not get back. I finally slipped on my glasses and began sorting through the envelopes. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the house. A few statements looked familiar. Some did not. One envelope in particular felt too heavy, too stiff. When I opened it, the words caught in my throat. A personal loan for $87,000. My name printed at the top, my address, my account details all correct except for the signature at the bottom. Someone had tried to copy the loop of my G and the tilt of my E. Whoever did it forgot the small upward lift I always make at the end of my name. It was close but wrong, in a way that felt like an insult more than a mistake. I leaned back in the chair and let the paper rest on my lap. I stared at the ceiling where the glow from the stove light dimmed into a soft yellow patch. The silence in the room grew heavier. I reached for my phone. My hands felt cold and slow as I scrolled through the contacts until I found the one I needed. My old friend Mark picked up after the first ring. He worked at West River Bank for nearly as long as I worked at the plant. His voice carried that tired steadiness of a man who knew trouble had come calling. He asked what happened. I told him enough for him to understand, and not enough for him to worry. There was a long pause on the other end before he spoke again. He said he would check what he could. I waited with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the shadow of my hands on the table. When Mark came back, his voice was lower. He said that Caleb's accounts had been flagged for review. He said the bank was monitoring his activity, that there were concerns about how he handled client funds. He did not say the word investigation, but I heard it anyway in the careful shape of his silence. The call ended. I set the phone down gently and sat there without moving. The room felt different now, not darker but hollow, as if the air had thinned. I reached for the pocket watch in my coat. It was still warm from being close to my skin. I placed it on the table, the old metal catching the faint light. I opened the lid and let my eyes rest on the familiar scratch of my father's handwriting. I thought of all the men before me who held that watch. Men who worked in mills and fields and small-town shops. Men who built their lives with their hands and trusted their families to carry their names with honor. I felt something break quietly inside me, not with anger, but with the slow ache of understanding. The hours passed without my noticing. The dryer clicked from the basement even though I had not done laundry. The fridge hummed. The wind pushed against the windows and rattled them lightly. Every small sound felt like a reminder of the life I had lived in this house, of the people I had loved here, of the boy I had raised, and the man he became without me seeing it happen. At 2:30 in the morning, I called Richard. He answered with a voice still thick with sleep, but he listened as I read the loan statement aloud. He told me to come by his office. He would meet me there. I grabbed my coat and took the pocket watch with me. The cold air outside hit hard, but it felt cleaner than the air in the house. The roads were nearly empty as I drove. The snow had slowed to light flakes drifting sideways in the wind. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. When I reached his building, the parking lot was dim under the single security lamp. Richard was already inside, a warm glow spilling from his window. He opened the door before I knocked. His tie hung loose around his neck, and his sleeves were rolled up. He motioned for me to sit while he set out a fresh stack of forms. His desk looked different at night, the lamp casting deep lines across his face. I handed him the loan statement. He read it slowly, then placed it beside the DPOA paperwork from earlier and the notes about the forged signatures. He glanced at the clock on the wall, then at me. He asked if I wanted to take the next step. I told him I did. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began writing in long, careful strokes. He drafted a new will. He added revisions. He crossed out sections and rewrote them with sharper clarity. I watched the ink move across the page like a quiet decision forming itself. He spoke little, only asking small questions when necessary. After the will came the trust. He explained the structure as he wrote. but my mind was fixed on Hazel. Her small hands, her bright eyes, her laughter the last time I saw her. The thought of protecting her steadied me in a way nothing else had in days. We worked until the first blue hint of dawn crept into the edges of the window. When he finished, he set the papers in front of me. The trust placed everything I owned in her name. I would manage it until she turned 25. No one else would touch it. No one else would claim it. The line of inheritance stretched behind me and ended with her unbroken by the choices of those who had forgotten what the name Ellison meant. I rested my hand on the pocket watch and let out a slow breath. The words came quietly, almost without sound. I told my son I was sorry. Not for the decision, but for the path that led us here. I signed the will. The pen glided across the page with a weight that felt final and necessary. Richard gathered the papers and locked them in his drawer. He did not say much. He did not need to. The air between us carried the understanding. When I stepped outside, the sky had begun to lighten. The frost on the windshields shimmered under the early morning glow. I stood there for a moment in the cold, letting the quiet wrap around me. Somewhere far off, a single bird called out, breaking the silence just enough to remind me the night had passed. I held the pocket watch in my hand and closed my fingers around it. The snow under my boots crunched as I took the first step toward the truck. The snow under my boots crunched as I took the first step toward the truck. The sky was still pale and empty, the kind of early light that makes everything look washed out. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, with my hands resting on the steering wheel and the pocket watch heavy in my coat. Then I started the engine and drove home to a house that felt different now that the papers were signed and the trust was real. The next few days moved in a strange, slow way. On the surface, nothing changed. I made coffee in the same chipped mug. I cleared the walk each morning before the sun came up. I sat at the kitchen table with the same view of the maple tree out back. But under all of that, something had shifted. The will was rewritten. The trust was set. The line I had been afraid to draw was now in ink. The calls from the bank started first. Short conversations. Polite words from people who had never spoken my name before, now saying it carefully, as they explained that certain transactions could not move forward without my direct approval. I confirmed the freezes each word like a small lock clicking shut. After that, the silence from Caleb and Marissa grew louder than any ring. It did not last. On the third day, just past noon, their car pulled into my driveway so fast, the tires pushed slush against the curb. I watched from the kitchen window as Caleb climbed out and slammed the door, his shoulders tight, his jaw set. Marissa stepped out on her side, wrapped in a coat that looked too thin for the weather, moving with that sharp determination I had seen in her eyes the night she stood behind him at the door. I felt the pocket watch in my pocket. My fingers found the small raised button along its side. Before they reached the porch, I pressed it once. The tiny click disappeared under the sound of their footsteps on the icy steps. The knock came hard, not the knock of someone asking to come in, but the knock of someone who believes they already have the right. I opened the door and stepped aside. The heat from inside rolled out around us. Marissa brushed past me first, bringing in a faint smell of perfume and cold air. Caleb followed his eyes, moving quickly around the room, as if taking stock of what he thought should be his. They stood in the living room. I closed the door and walked to the table where I had laid everything out that morning. The forged deeds, the letter from the title company, the copy of the note from the notary, the papers Richard drafted for the trust. Each stack sat in a neat line waiting. Marissa spoke first. Her voice had lost its polite edges. She asked what I thought I was doing, freezing accounts and blocking transfers. She said this made me look unstable. She said people would start to ask questions. Her words came one after another, quick and sharp. Caleb stayed quiet at her side, but his breathing was too fast. His fingers twitched near his pockets. He looked like a man who had already spent days waiting for a blow he could not see. I told them to sit. Caleb dropped into the chair like the weight had been pulled from his legs. Marissa remained standing for a moment, as if refusing obedience, then sat as well. Her coat slipped from her shoulders and fell across the back of the chair. I slid the first set of papers toward them. The copies of the deed transfers. My name. My signature, or what someone thought it should look like. I said nothing at first. I let their eyes move across the pages. Caleb stared without blinking. Marissa gave the papers a quick glance, then looked up at me. She said it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error, something the bank or the title company had messed up. I laid the next document on the table. The letter from the title company, the one that mentioned the sheriff. I did not read it aloud. Not read. The printed lines spoke for themselves. Marissa shifted in her seat. The bravado in her posture began to look more like impatience. Then I placed the notes from the local notary on top of the stack. The account of Caleb coming in with documents months earlier, the refusal to notarize a signature that did not feel right, the request that he bring me in, and the fact he never did. Caleb rubbed his forehead with his thumb and index finger. A small sound left his throat, half sigh and half groan. He said my name soft like he did when he was a boy, and caught lying about something that mattered more than he realized. Marissa snapped then. She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. She said I was making a big deal out of nothing, that this was all or my own good, that I had almost signed once already when they came after the health scare, and if I had done it, then none of this would be happening. Her face flushed red. She called me stubborn. She called me ungrateful for the help they tried to give. I let her words hang in the air for a moment. Then I reached into my pocket and placed the pocket watch in the center of the table. Its lid was closed, the metal dull and worn. Caleb glanced at it with a look that carried something like recognition. Marissa looked annoyed, as if this were one more old thing she would have to clear out of the house someday. I told them the watch had been in my pocket since before they arrived. I told them that Ohio law allowed a conversation to be recorded with the consent of one person in the room, and that person was me. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. I just laid the truth out as simply as the papers in front of them. Marissa's mouth opened, then closed. Caleb swallowed hard. He understood faster than she did. He asked if I was serious. I did not answer with words. I pressed the small button again, and the watch gave a soft mechanical click. The room went quiet. The heater hummed against the wall. The faint sound of a car passing outside drifted in and faded. It was the kind of silence that comes when all the noise inside a man's life is suddenly stripped away, and only the essential remains. Caleb sank back in his chair. His shoulders sagged as if something inside him had finally given out. He said he was scared. He said the numbers had gotten away from him. Credit cards, loans, things he thought he could juggle. He said every month he told himself he would fix it, and every month it got worse. His voice cracked when he mentioned Hazel. He said he did not want his daughter to know any of this. Marissa cut in, saying it was the economy, saying interest rates were to blame, saying everyone did it. She used the word circumstances, as if it were a shield big enough to cover everything laid out on the table. She said if I had just trusted them, none of this would have reached banks and lawyers and neighbors. I looked at my son, not at his suit, or his posture, or the way he tried to hold himself together. I looked at the same eyes that once watched fireworks from my shoulders. the same hands that once reached for mine in a crowded grocery store. Behind the man who had signed my name without asking was still that boy. Somewhere under the debt, and the fear, and the pride. When I spoke, my voice felt different in my own ears. Lower, colder. I told them they had not only gone after my house and my accounts. They had taken the name Ellison and dragged it into rooms where it never belonged. I told them they had broken the one thing a man is supposed to leave behind when his work is done. The words sat in the air and did not move. Caleb stared at the table. His knuckles were white where his hands clenched together. Marissa's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, or maybe just panic. The papers rustled softly when a draft slipped under the front door. No one spoke. The house held its breath with us. I reached for the watch and closed my fingers around it. The metal was cool against my palm. I did not say what would happen next. I did not lay out threats or promises. I let the silence rest between us, heavy and real, a line drawn that could be seen even if no one wanted to look directly at it. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and fell quiet again. The light through the window had shifted, turning the edges of the room into soft shadows. I watched my son for another long moment, then slowly gathered the papers into a neat stack, each page sliding over the other, with a faint sound that seemed to mark the end of something none of us yet knew how to name. The house stayed quiet long after the door closed behind them. Their voices had faded, yet the air still carried the shape of the argument, like dust hanging after furniture is moved. I gathered the papers from the table and returned them to the drawer, then rested both hands on the wood as if I needed the weight of it to steady me. The pocket watch sat alone in the center of the table, its thin ticking the only sound that felt honest in the room. The days that followed moved slowly, stretched thin by winter light. I cleared snow from the walk before the neighborhood woke. I drove into town for groceries and nodded to the same people who asked nothing beyond how the weather felt that morning. At a red light near the store, I saw Hazel stepping over a patch of ice while her mother held her hand. Her scarf fluttered behind her in the wind. She laughed at something I could not hear. I stayed in the truck and let the moment pass without reaching for it. 2 weeks after the confrontation, when the afternoon had settled into a quiet gray, someone knocked on my door. The sound was soft, more hesitant than the pounding from before. I set down the mug in my hand and walked toward it, listening to the floor creak beneath my steps. When I opened the door, Caleb stood on the porch alone. His coat looked too thin for the weather, and his breath came in uneven clouds. The tiredness in his eyes reached deeper than anything he had said in my kitchen the last time he stood there. He asked if he could come in. His voice was low and plain. I stepped aside without replying. He entered the house like a man walking into a place he once knew well, but was no longer sure he belonged in. A worn leather folder was tucked under his arm. He sat at the kitchen table without waiting for me to offer a seat. He placed the folder in the center and opened it with slow hands. Inside were documents spread neatly in a stack. The first pages were from the county clerk, the start of divorce filings. Beneath them were receipts from a therapist, each session marked with dates and times. There were papers showing the sale of their second car and the closing of accounts I never knew existed. The ink looked fresh on most of them, as if the printer was still warm when he left wherever he had come from. He kept his gaze on the documents. He said Marissa had left soon after the freezes took effect. There had been shouting that spilled into the hall of their building, words they could not take back. When she realized no inheritance would reach her hands, she chose the road that carried fewer burdens. He said it softly, as if saying it any louder might shatter something still fragile inside him. He took a slow breath and looked up at me for the first time. His eyes were rimmed with red, not from anger, but from nights spent awake with thoughts he could no longer outrun. He said he started therapy because he needed someone to ask him questions he had avoided for years. He talked about the feeling of waking each morning and carrying the same heavy lie, hoping no one would notice how far he was sinking. Then he said he had chosen Hazel over Marissa. He said it without pride and without expectation. He said he had been wrong. He said it quietly, the kind of quiet that is not weakness, but surrender to the truth. I let the silence stretch. I watched his hands twist together on the table, watched the rise and fall of his breath, as if he were waiting for a sentence to be passed. The clock on the wall marked each second with a soft echo. Outside, a plow moved down the street, its blade scraping against the packed snow. I asked him what he had told Hazel. The question caught him off guard. His shoulders tightened, and his voice dropped even lower. He said he told her he had to stay somewhere else for a while. He said she asked if everything was all right. He said he told her yes, even though it was the farthest thing from the truth. The words seemed to shake something loose in him. His eyes glistened, though no tears fell. He turned his head slightly, as if hiding the weakness from a father he still feared disappointing. I leaned back in my chair. The anger from before had cooled into something sharper and more controlled. I told him I was not going to pretend the past had not happened. I told him the trust would remain as it was set for Hazel and unreachable to anyone else. But if he wanted any hope of rebuilding what he had broken, there would be terms he would follow without exception. I laid them out slowly. 2 years of therapy with no missed sessions. Complete financial transparency, including every debt, every loan, every line of credit. Parenting. Hazel with honesty and steadiness, not performance or desperation. I told him I would not tolerate shortcuts or excuses. A man who wants redemption needs to carry the weight of his choices without shifting it onto someone else. While I spoke, he listened with a stillness that surprised me. There was no argument, no attempt to negotiate. Just a quiet nod, the kind a man gives when he knows there is no other road left that leads anywhere worth going. He gathered the documents one by one and returned them to the folder. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask when things would feel normal again. He only said he would do the work not because it guaranteed anything with me, but because Hazel deserved a father who could stand in the daylight without lying about the shadows behind him. I walked him to the door. He paused there, looking at the yard where the snow had begun to melt in uneven patches. He thanked me. The words were small, but they were not empty. Then he stepped onto the porch and started down the path. His footsteps left soft impressions in the snow, each one fading as the wind swept across the yard. When the door closed, the house felt broader somehow, as if something long compressed had opened its lungs. I returned to the kitchen and sat where he had been sitting moments earlier. The pocket watch lay on the table, its metal catching the late afternoon light. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. My thumb traced the familiar scratches on the lid, before finding a small ridge I had never noticed. I pressed it, and a hidden panel shifted open. Inside was a second inscription carved in a rougher hand than the one on the front. If your son loses his way, guide him home before you lock the door forever. I read the line twice, feeling the weight of the words settle quietly into the room. The watch ticked steadily, the sound thin and unwavering. I closed the panel and rested the watch on the table. Outside, somewhere down the street, a car engine started and faded into the distance. The house grew still again, holding its breath between what had been spoken and what had yet to come. The house felt quieter after Caleb left, the kind of quiet that settles deep enough for a man to hear his own breath. I stayed at the table with the watch resting in my palm, its weight familiar, yet heavier than I remembered. Snow tapped softly at the window, each sound a reminder of the night everything had changed a year ago. I closed my hand around the watch and let the silence stay with me until the light outside faded into the soft blue of early evening. The months that followed moved in slow turns, like the steady swing of that old watch's hands. Spring brought its rain, the kind that rolls down the gutter and carries winter's dust off the steps. I kept busy with small tasks around the house, repairing fences, sorting tools, tending to the garden Evelyn once loved. In those hours, I let my thoughts settle without pushing them anywhere. Healing, I learned, happens the way frost melts on a roof, quiet and unnoticed. Caleb appeared in passing during those early months. A wave from across the parking lot, a nod when he dropped Hazel off, and caught sight of me tightening a loose board near the porch. There was a caution between us, not sharp, but careful, like two men learning how to walk near each other again. He spoke little, and when he did, the words were plain. He never asked for forgiveness and never rushed what was still fragile. His changes came slowly, but they stayed. The newer car he once prized disappeared, replaced by an older sedan with a soft rattle in the engine. He took a modest job at a community bank, the kind of work with no shine but plenty of honesty. His debts shrank one bill at a time. The frantic pride he once carried gave way to something steadier, a quiet humility that showed more than he ever said. Hazel grew quickly that year. She came to the house with stories about constellations and school projects, her voice bright and clear. She liked winter stars best, and asked me once why they seemed sharper in the cold. I told her they always had been that way, even when I was a boy on my father's porch. She smiled at that, as if she could see both nights at once. By December, the cold had returned, covering the yard in a clean white layer that caught the porch light in soft glimmers. I found myself again at the kitchen table with the watch beside me, its steady tick warming the quiet room. There was no anger left, only a kind of waiting I did not name. On Christmas Eve, as dusk settled into the trees, a knock sounded at the door. It was not hurried or weak, just a simple knock from someone hoping the person inside might open it. I stood still for a moment, feeling my breath catch just slightly before I walked to the door. When I opened it, Caleb stood there with Hazel at his side. Snow clung to his shoulders, and his eyes held a mixture of hope and caution that felt painfully familiar. He greeted me with the word "Dad," spoken softly, without strain. It landed in the quiet, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything I had tried to hold still. I stepped aside and let them in. Hazel rushed toward the tree, pointing at the glass ornament. She loved her laughter lifting the room. Caleb stayed near the doorway, his hands resting uneasily at his sides. For a moment he looked as if he might step back out into the cold, unsure if he was welcome. I moved closer and rested my hand on a chair near him, a small gesture meant to bridge a distance built over years. He sat slowly and watched the watch glint in the soft light. I picked it up, feeling the familiar click beneath my thumb. The metal was warm from the room and from the generations that had carried it before me. I turned it once, then placed it gently into his hand. His fingers closed around it, but his hand trembled. He looked up, and in his eyes I saw flashes of all the years between us, the good ones, and the ones we had nearly lost. I told him that legacy is something a man earns through the choices he makes when no one is there to praise him, and that the past year had shown me more than words ever could. His breath shook and tears formed quiet and unguarded. Hazel noticed and came to him, her small arms wrapping around both of us until our shoulders touched. Behind him, the new will lay on the table just as it had for months. Its pages remained unsigned, not from hesitation, but from intention. Trust, I had learned, grows slowly and does not need signatures to begin its return. Caleb's eyes drifted to it for a moment, and understanding passed between us without either of us saying a word. The tree lights flickered softly, casting warm shadows across the room. Outside, snow moved through the air in gentle patterns, settling along the porch and gathering on the steps. When they stood to leave, Hazel held my hand for a moment, her mitten soft against my palm. Caleb paused at the doorway, his breath visible in the cold air, as he looked back, unsure if he should say anything more. I kept the door open, the warm air brushing against the cold night. They walked down the path together, footprints forming twin lines in the fresh snow. Caleb turned once near the street, his face lit by the glow from the porch. I raised a hand, just a slight motion enough for him to know the door would not close quickly or easily again. As their figures faded into the quiet evening, I stayed at the doorway and listened to the soft hush of snow settling across the yard. The watch ticked faintly in my pocket, steady and calm, a reminder that time moves forward whether we fear it or welcome it. The night deepened, and when I finally stepped back inside, the warmth of the house felt different, lighter somehow, as if some long-held breath had finally been released.